She believed she was stepping back into the spotlight like a princess returning to her court, but instead she became the punchline of the night. And that was the instant the illusion fractured beyond repair. 1 second Meghan Markle was smiling, luminous, wrapped in a meticulously chosen gown, embodying the polished serenity of someone who had spent half a decade sculpting her public image with surgical precision. The next second the atmosphere shifted, the ballroom subtly tilted, not physically but socially, cameras recalibrated. Alistair's glanced sideways, the kind of glances that say more than words ever could. And then, slicing clean through the air, a microphone captured Chelsea Handler's voice, casual yet razor-sharp. "Give it up for our real royalty tonight, the ones with actual titles." A pause, perfectly timed. Nervous laughter fluttered across the room. A few gasps lagged behind, arriving just late enough to confirm the damage. Meghan's smile didn't vanish, not immediately. It lingered, stiff and overextended, like a mask refusing to fall even after the string had snapped. That moment didn't stay contained within the ballroom. It escaped instantly, digitized, clipped, captioned, and sent ricocheting across the internet before the ceremony had even reached its midpoint. And while it looked like just another awards show joke, it was a cultural rupture, a flashpoint. A signal that something fundamental had shifted in how fame, fantasy, and borrowed crowns were being tolerated. This wasn't just about Meghan Markle. It was about the collective exhaustion with performance masquerading as purpose. To grasp the weight of that moment, you have to rewind to a time when this outcome would have sounded laughable. In 2018, when nearly 2 billion people tuned in to watch her walk into a modern fairy tale. The idea that she would one day be openly mocked for her title in front of Hollywood's elite would have sounded deranged. Back then, she was the symbol of reinvention, the American outsider elevated into monarchy, the promise of progress stitched into silk and tradition. She was marketed as history in motion. The future made flesh. Anyone suggesting that 8 years later she'd be seated silently while her legitimacy was publicly questioned would have been dismissed as bitter or delusional. But history has a way of accelerating. By January 2026, that improbable future had arrived in full view. At the Critics' Choice Awards, Chelsea Handler stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was holding and how dangerous it was. She'd hosted before. She knew the rhythms, the unspoken boundaries, the tolerance levels of a room packed with power. And this time she chose precision over blunt force. She didn't say Meghan's name, she didn't need to. The restraint made the cut deeper. By praising real royalty, by letting the implication hang in the air long enough to ferment, she allowed the room to complete the thought. And Meghan, seated near the front in white, felt it instantly. You could see it if you knew where to look, the blink that came too quickly, the shoulders that squared defensively. The eyes that flicked toward the stage and then away, because for her this wasn't just a jab, it was a message, a public confirmation that the costume no longer commanded automatic reverence. Chelsea Handler isn't just a comedian, she's a barometer. Her jokes sting because they articulate what's already circulating beneath the surface. She says the part out loud that everyone else pretends not to notice. And for years, the question trailing Meghan Markle had grown increasingly unavoidable. What exactly was she now? She wasn't a working royal, she wasn't anchored to successful film or television projects. Her ventures promised much and delivered quietly little. Netflix cooled its enthusiasm. Spotify ended its relationship without ceremony. Her foundation produced headlines but not momentum. Yet she continued to arrive on red carpets with the posture of inevitability, as though applause was still a birthright. That disconnect was the joke, and that's why it landed with such force. America has always had a complicated relationship with royalty. We don't have our own, so we borrow. We glamorize foreign crowns, consume the mythology, binge the scandals. For a while, Meghan fit perfectly into that borrowed dream. She was the narrative people wanted to believe in, the proof that tradition could be disrupted and still sparkle. But narratives collapse when repetition replaces substance. Over time, the interviews began to sound familiar. The documentaries felt less like revelations and more like rehearsals. The causes blurred into branding exercises, and slowly, imperceptibly, the audience stopped leaning forward. By the time 2026 arrived, Hollywood itself had hardened. The pandemic, the strikes, the cultural reckonings had stripped away some of the industry's tolerance for illusion. Authenticity became currency, pretense became liability. So when Chelsea Handler delivered that line, it wasn't just comedy, it was a referendum. And what made it devastating wasn't the laughter, it was what didn't follow: no immediate backlash. No chorus of defenders, no frantic reframing from powerful allies, just a vacuum, silence, and in Hollywood, silence is never neutral. Meghan had entered that room alone, deliberately so, wrapped in symbolism meant to communicate rebirth, independence, relevance. The white dress, the heritage label, the solo arrival, all signals. But confidence only commands respect when it's reinforced by momentum. Inside the venue, reactions were measured at best, distant at worst. She wasn't nominated, she wasn't presenting. She wasn't attached to the work being celebrated. She was simply there, occupying space that once belonged to influence. Chelsea continued, unfazed, warming the crowd before cutting directly to the nerve. Not loud, not cruel, just exact. When the line landed, the room told the truth. Some laughed too hard, a reflex of relief. Some didn't laugh at all, most avoided looking anywhere near Meghan's row. Within minutes, the internet crowned the moment. Clips circulated. Captions sharpened. "She still thinks she's royalty" became the unofficial refrain of the night. Backstage, her team moved quietly, unsuccessfully, trying to soften a narrative that had already slipped beyond their control. Chelsea didn't apologize, she didn't retreat. She knew precisely what she'd done. Meghan sat through the rest of the ceremony composed, applauding when expected, smiling when cameras drifted her way. But something had shifted irreversibly. Because her real power had never been the title itself, it was the assumption that she was untouchable, and once that assumption collapsed, everything else followed. If a comedian could openly mock her in front of the industry and no one rushed to counter it, what did that say? When the lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, the damage didn't stay confined to that room. It spilled outward, into private messages, into editorial meetings, into whispers that hardened into consensus by morning. Her arrival, intended as a reassertion, became the symbol of overreach. The regal pacing, the controlled walk, the fairy tale aesthetic began to read not as authority but as insistence, a performance demanding belief from an audience that had already seen too many acts. And that was the true unraveling, not a single joke, not a single night, but the moment a woman famous for rewriting her narrative stepped into a room that no longer wanted revisions. What unfolded wasn't just another awards show incident. It was a quiet, collective decision that the crown had finally slipped, and this time no one moved to catch it. What most people didn't realize in the moment was that the unraveling had begun long before Chelsea Handler ever touched the microphone. The joke didn't create the fracture, it merely revealed it under bright lights. By the time Meghan Markle decided to attend the 2026 Critics' Choice Awards, the ground beneath her image had already been eroding quietly, steadily, year after year. This appearance wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't casual, it was calculated down to the minute. Insiders later revealed that the decision to attend solo had been debated heavily within her circle. Some advised against it, warning that the industry climate had shifted, that sentiment had cooled, that visibility without purpose could backfire. But Meghan pushed forward, she always had. Visibility had once been her weapon, she believed it could be again. Arriving alone was meant to project autonomy, strength, a subtle distancing from the royal baggage while still benefiting from its aura. The message was clear: I don't need the prince, I am the brand. The problem was that brands require demand, and demand had grown thin. The red carpet told that story before a single word was spoken on stage. When her SUV pulled up, the reaction wasn't electric, it was hesitant. Photographers lifted their cameras, then paused, unsure whether to treat her like a headliner or a footnote. Some called her name, others didn't bother. A few lenses drifted elsewhere almost immediately. In Hollywood, that hesitation speaks louder than boos ever could. Meghan stepped out anyway, composed, deliberate, her walk measured and regal. She wore white again, because white had always been her visual shorthand for innocence, rebirth, and moral clarity. Dior, because Dior signals old-world prestige without explanation. Every element was chosen to whisper royalty without saying it out loud. But when symbolism outpaces substance, it starts to feel like costume, and several people watching knew it. You could see it in the sidelong glances, the polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the way conversations paused and then resumed once she passed. She posed confidently, adjusting her stance, offering angles she knew photographers liked. This was muscle memory. She had mastered the mechanics of arrival. But mastery of mechanics doesn't guarantee relevance. Inside the venue, the contrast sharpened. Meghan took her seat near the front, close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid overt scrutiny. Around her sat actors, writers, directors whose work had survived brutal industry reckonings. People who had weathered strikes, flops, cancellations, and still returned with something tangible to show for it. Meghan, by comparison, was unattached, no nomination, no project. No clear reason to be there beyond presence itself. In Hollywood, presence without contribution reads as entitlement, and entitlement once whispered becomes radioactive. Some nodded at her politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few seemed genuinely surprised to see her. Not awed, surprised, that distinction matters. Meanwhile, backstage, Chelsea Handler was pacing through final notes. She'd been warned gently that some jokes might land harder than intended. There had been murmurs from production, vague suggestions about keeping things light. Chelsea listened, smiled, and made no promises. She understood something crucial: the room was ready. Comedy only works when the audience is already leaning toward the truth. By the time she walked on stage, she wasn't just delivering jokes, she was reading the temperature. When her line about real royalty landed, it landed because it articulated a thought many in that room had quietly shared. Meghan's status had become ambiguous, suspended between worlds. No longer royal in function, no longer Hollywood in output, existing in a liminal space sustained largely by memory and media echo. The joke crystallized that ambiguity into something undeniable. And what followed was just as important as the line itself. There was no immediate rescue, no high-profile laughter of support, no pointed applause meant to reframe the moment as harmless. The industry collectively let it sit. Social media did the rest. Clips spread faster than context ever could. Captions sharpened the edges. Comment sections turned brutal. This wasn't just mockery, it was fatigue finally finding a voice. People weren't reacting to a single night, they were reacting to years of perceived overexposure without payoff. Backstage after the monologue, tension spiked. Meghan's team moved carefully, whispering, assessing whether intervention was possible or even advisable. It was. Any attempt to confront or complain would only amplify the moment. Silence, once again, was the chosen strategy. Meghan remained seated, posture perfect, applause measured. But witnesses later noted the shift: less eye contact, more rigidity, a kind of inward retreat. When the show finally ended and the room began to empty, she left quickly, bypassing the usual post-show mingling. No victory laps, no extended conversations. The exit was efficient, controlled, almost defensive. And outside, the narrative had already calcified. By morning, headlines weren't about winners or speeches, they were about that moment, that line. That silence, what made it sting wasn't cruelty, it was consensus. There was no rallying cry to defend her, no wave of think pieces reframing her as victim. Even longtime supporters struggled to explain why she had been there in the first place. And that question lingered, unanswered. Why was she there? What was she reasserting? What was she claiming? The absence of a clear answer became the answer itself. Meghan Markle's power had always been narrative-driven. She controlled the frame, the pacing, the emotional arc. But narratives only hold when the audience consents to stay engaged. That night, the consent quietly expired. The fairy tale aesthetic, once aspirational, began to feel repetitive. The insistence on relevance, once admirable, now felt strained. And in Hollywood, strain reads as vulnerability. By the time dawn broke over Lowe's Angels, the moment had already been archived, analyzed, and memed into permanence. It wasn't just a bad night, it was a signal. A sign that the cultural contract had changed. That titles borrowed from a world left behind no longer carried automatic weight in a space obsessed with output and proof. Meghan had walked into that ballroom believing she could still command the room through symbolism alone. What she discovered instead was that symbolism without substance now invited satire. And satire, once unleashed, doesn't politely retreat, it lingers, it reframes, it erodes. And as the fallout continued to ripple outward, one question grew louder than all the rest. if this was how the industry reacted when the mask slipped. What would happen next when she tried to put it back on? In the days that followed, the reaction didn't soften, it sharpened. What might once have been smoothed over by sympathetic press or redirected outrage instead metastasized into something colder and far more dangerous: indifference mixed with ridicule. Morning shows mentioned the moment briefly, then moved on. Trade publications framed it not as controversy but as inevitability. Online, the language shifted from debate to conclusion. People weren't asking whether Chelsea Handler had gone too far. They were asking why it had taken so long for someone to say it out loud. And that distinction mattered, because outrage can be managed. Fatigue cannot. Meghan Markle had built her post-royal identity on visibility, on the belief that being seen equaled being relevant. But relevance, it turned out, now demanded receipts, projects. Impact, evidence of evolution beyond grievance and glamour. Without those, visibility became exposure, and exposure invited scrutiny. The critic's choice moment cracked open a door many had been quietly circling for years, and once open, it didn't close. Behind the scenes, the recalibration began almost immediately. Public relations consultants were looped in, crisis messaging drafts circulated. Some urged a response, a carefully worded statement reframing the joke as misogyny, elitism, or cruelty. Others advised restraint, warning that any reaction would only validate the premise of the joke. Meghan herself, according to multiple sources, was furious but controlled. Anger, she knew, could be weaponized against her. Silence had always been her shield when momentum slipped, but this silence felt different. It wasn't commanding, it was hollow. Because for the first time, no one seemed particularly interested in what she would say next. That was the real blow. The media cycle didn't wait for her. It moved on, dragging the moment with it as shorthand for something larger, the collapse of a carefully curated mystique. Industry insiders began speaking more freely, off the record at first, then with increasing boldness. Producers questioned her reliability. Executives described meetings that went nowhere. Collaborators hinted at creative paralysis, at an obsession with optics that suffocated substance. None of this was new, but now it was being said aloud, contextualized by that single line on stage. The joke had given people permission to acknowledge what had been inconvenient to admit. That Meghan Markle's post-royal chapter had stalled, not because of sabotage or prejudice, but because the story she kept telling no longer evolved. Every appearance felt like a rerun. Every interview circled the same emotional beats, and audiences, conditioned by years of relentless content, recognized repetition instantly. The red carpet footage continued to resurface, slowed down, dissected, overlaid with commentary, the subtle hesitations from photographers, the side glances. The moments of social friction that once might have been dismissed as coincidence were now reinterpreted as pattern. Even neutral observers began to note how out of place she seemed, how disconnected her presence was from the actual purpose of the event. That dissonance became symbolic. Meghan wasn't rejected loudly. She was absorbed quietly into the background noise of Hollywood excess, where relevance is fleeting and nostalgia is not currency. The irony was brutal. She had left the monarchy to control her narrative, to escape rigid hierarchies and scripted roles. Yet here she was, frozen in a role she couldn't exit, clinging to symbols of authority in a space that demanded reinvention. Chelsea Handler, meanwhile, barely addressed the fallout. When asked about the joke days later, she shrugged it off with practiced nonchalance. Comedy, she said, observation, truth with a microphone, and the lack of apology spoke volumes. There was no sense that she'd crossed an invisible line, no whisper of industry backlash. If anything, her stock rose. The moment cemented her reputation as someone willing to puncture inflated personas, even when they arrived wrapped in prestige. That contrast only amplified Meghan's isolation. In an industry built on alliances, she found herself increasingly without visible defenders. Not because people hated her, but because defending her no longer offered upside. As weeks passed, the moment became a reference point, shorthand in conversations about fame without function. It was cited in panels, joked about in writers' rooms, alluded to obliquely in think pieces about the decline of celebrity exceptionalism. Meghan's name wasn't always mentioned, but the archetype was clear: the borrowed crown, the endless reinvention without reinvention, the insistence on importance untethered from output. What had once been aspirational had calcified into cautionary, and that transformation was irreversible. Once the audience sees the strings, suspension of disbelief collapses. The most striking part was what didn't happen next. There was no triumphant pivot, no surprise project that reasserted credibility, no cultural moment that demanded reassessment. Instead, there were quiet sightings, curated appearances, carefully staged photos that failed to generate more than fleeting interest. The magic, once self-sustaining, now required constant effort, and effort was visible. Meghan Markle had always excelled at commanding attention, but attention without admiration is unstable. It flickers, it turns, and eventually it drifts. The Critics' Choice Awards hadn't ended her relevance, they had redefined it, from aspirational figure to subjective commentary. From protagonist to symbol. In the end, what made that night historic wasn't humiliation. It was exposure, the exposure of a gap between how someone sees themselves and how the world now sees them. Meghan walked into that ballroom believing the story was still hers to tell. What she discovered instead was that the audience had already moved ahead, had already drawn conclusions without waiting for the next chapter. The crown she carried was no longer contested. It was simply ignored, and in a culture that thrives on attention, being ignored is the final verdict.